From the White House in the office of the President of the United States, we present an address by Dwight D. Eisenhower. This is the farewell address for President Eisenhower, whose 8 years as chief executive come to an end at noon Friday.
Good evening, my fellow Americans. We now stand 10 years past the midpoint of a century that has witnessed 4 major wars among great nations. 3 of these involved our own country. We have been compelled to create a permanent armaments industry of vast proportions. 3.5 million men and women are directly engaged in the defense establishment. Now, this conjunction of an immense military establishment and a large arms industry is new in the American experience. We recognize the imperative need for this development, yet we must not fail to comprehend its grave implications.
Why do we bury our sons and brothers in lonely graves far from home? Our men are dying to preserve a way of life. These privileges, these rights, they're precious enough to fight for, precious enough to die for.
The greatest force for good in the world, and we have not an obligation to go out and fight and start wars, but to certainly do everything we can to spread democracy and freedom throughout the world.
We shall pay any price, bear any burden to assure the survival and the success of liberty.
What are we fighting for? Freedom? Freedom.
I think we fight because it's necessary and because it's right.
We're not talking simply about the price of gas. We are talking about the price of liberty.
We seek neither territory nor bases. We fight for the principle of self-determination.
America's strength and, yes, her military power have been a force for peace, not conquest.
By keeping our military strong, by using force where we must, America is making a difference for people here and around the world.
Our cause is just, and no matter how long it takes, we will defeat the enemies of freedom.
I was on my way into work, and I was taking the subway, which is elevated subway. And as the subway heads to New York, there comes a point where it makes a very abrupt left-hand turn, almost a 90-degree turn. And when it does that, the wheels of the subway always screech loudly. If you look out the window, that's when you can see the World Trade Center. I was sitting on the subway reading, as I always do. Train made the left-hand turn. The wheels screeched. Everybody in the car jumped up and started to gasp. Oh! And I look up, and there's the building with smoke pouring out of it. I didn't know if that was my son's building because Tower 1 and Tower 2 were in perfect symmetry. And I didn't know which tower I'm looking at. And I'm just thinking to myself, how did my son get out of there? Well, I don't know how, but he got out of there. There's no two ways about that. He can't be in there because anybody who's in there is going to die.
Blowback. It's a CIA term. Blowback does not mean simply the unintended consequences of foreign operations. It means the unintended consequences of foreign operations that were deliberately kept secret from the American public, so that when the retaliation comes, the American public is not able to put it in context, to put cause and effect together that they come up with questions like, why do they hate us?
The forces of evil declared war on the American
Not since Pearl Harbor has there been so much national
Freedom and democracy are under attack.
Why do they hate us? That's the question everybody's asking.
Our government did not want the forensic question asked, what were their motives? And instead chose to say they were just evildoers.
And the towers keep falling. Every 5 minutes, there go the tower again. I got on the phone, I called NBC. I'm listening to your newscast. How many times are you going to show those goddamn towers coming down? Don't you have any respect for the people who have family and friends in those towers? Do we have to keep watching them fall down? I watched them fall down 50 times already. When are you going to stop? Please stop. You're ripping my heart out. God gave me two of the greatest sons any parent could ever ask for. Why he took one back, I'll never know.
I can hear you, the rest of the world hears you, and the people who knock these buildings down will hear all of us soon.
Somebody had to pay for this. Somebody had to pay for 9/11. I want enemy dead. I want to see their bodies stacked up for what they did, for taking my son.
There was a moment when the entire world was behind us. There was 1 million people demonstrating in the streets of Tehran in favor of the United States. We had the world behind us. Now kids are dying. Billions are being spent every month. Animosity against the United States is stronger now than it ever has been in history. What happened here? Is it just the experience of September 11th? Or is there something else going on here? When something like this happens, you've got to take stock of this. You've got to understand what went wrong here.
We live here in the United States of amnesia. No one remembers anything before Monday morning. Everything is a blank. We have no history.
Guatemala, 1954. The United States intervened unilaterally to protect its vital interests. Lebanon, 1958. The United States feels its policy of containment in the Middle East is threatened. Responds openly and unilaterally. The United States intervened in Laos, the Congo, Brazil.
There are so many theories about what happened in Iraq and why we really went in, but when you look at the history of the United States, almost every president, there is something we don't like somewhere in the world, and we've got to dispense military force.
Ronald Reagan invaded Grenada in 1983.
Last night, I ordered U.S. military forces to Panama.
This is not about one president or one party. We fight as a nation because we perceive it is in our interest to fight. And we then mention words like freedom and nice common values that who can be against freedom, when in fact much more has been going on privately.
Just completed a meeting with our national security team, and we've received the latest intelligence updates. The deliberate and deadly attacks which were carried out yesterday against our country were more than acts of terror. They were acts of war.
September 11th, 2001, provided a group of people deeply committed to the expansion of the American empire the opportunity to implement plans that they had been laying since 1992. At that time, a young Paul Wolfowitz was working as a subordinate position under Dick Cheney, who was then Secretary of Defense in the Pentagon. With the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, Cheney orders Wolfowitz to write a plan, to write a grand strategy. that it was now our destiny, that without the Soviet Union, there is no one who can possibly approach us in military terms. It says that's the way it ought to be, and our policy must be to maintain and expand that we are the new Rome. That's their strategy. On 9/11, they begin to implement it.
It's not just simply a matter of capturing people and holding them accountable, but removing the sanctuaries, removing the support systems, ending states who sponsor terrorism.
The people who came in with the president, or many of them anyway, were certainly prepared to shift direction, and in a radical direction. I think it's fair to say radical.
When September 11th happened, the president and his top advisors said to themselves, correctly, I think, we need to rethink American foreign policy. And I think that would have happened even without September 11th. But September 11th was really the event that changed American foreign policy.
Well, I was in the Pentagon when we got hit. You know, yes, it did change. It was a very dramatic and terrible thing. And it does change your perspective. But the war in Iraq had nothing to do with the war on terrorism. That was a huge leap, a manufactured leap, in order to implement a very calculated and pre-developed foreign policy.
We must take the battle to the enemy, disrupt his plans, and confront the worst threats before they emerge.
The Bush doctrine is that preemptive strikes or preemptive conflicts, which were never contemplated in the past, now have to be contemplated under certain scenarios.
If you saw a missile about to be launched and you could kick it over before it could be launched, you'd do it, of course. If you saw someone about to shoot at you and you thought you could shoot first, you'd do it. It's common sense. I don't know anybody who doesn't agree with that. So what's the big fuss about preemption?
March 19th is a night I will never forget. March 19th is one for the history books. It's one for my personal history books. When we first got the phone call, all we were told was we have a high priority mission, a high value target. It was what it was released to us was it was a leadership target.
The F-117 is an extraordinary machine, and it is only ordered forward on the order of the President or the Secretary of Defense.
First night of the conflict, the 117 pilots were fully trained. All they had to do was be briefed, have the weapons put on.
The whole mission up to this point was kept at the top secret levels. I think they really didn't expect both of us to come back, which is why they sent 2 jets. It's now 3:30. We have to hit the target at 5:30 or all bets are off. The President of the United States saw a target of opportunity, and they wanted to take advantage of it, and they did.
It's quite chilly and cold. I'm looking southward, expecting any attack to come in from the south. The choice and the timing is entirely now in the hands of the Allies.
The Bush doctrine is certainly not something unprecedented, unknown in American life. This statement that we are going to dominate the world through military power, that we reserve to ourselves the right of preemptive war. It is an extreme statement of what has been there in the works for a long time. World War II is, without question, the formation of the American military empire.
General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander-in-Chief, Allied Expeditionary Force.
I have complete confidence that the soldiers, sailors, and airmen of the United Nations will demonstrate that an aroused democracy is the most formidable fighting machine that can be devised.
Eisenhower was there and saw it happening. He had seen the buildup of the American military to fight World War II.
In this war, more than any other in history, we are on the side of decency and democracy and liberty.
He believed very deeply in the necessity for World War II and felt that Nazism was a terrible tyranny. And he brought this conviction and drive to defeating Nazi Germany.
People waited for this moment. The
culminating victory, the end of the war.
We were on top of the world. We were the only unwrecked major power on Earth. Europe was bleeding to death. Japan was gone. Those paper cities had all been burned up. So what are we doing?
At 2:45 in the morning, August 6, 1945, Colonel Tibbets takes the Enola Gay.
It is an atomic bomb. It is a harnessing of the basic power of the universe.
The United States bombed the Japanese city of Hiroshima on August 6, 1945, and 3 days later, they detonated another atomic bomb on the city of Nagasaki.
What has been done is the greatest achievement of organized science in history.
I can remember in the Pacific when the word spread that the bombs had been dropped. 99.9% of us were delighted because we'd been convinced that if Japan was not hit by nuclear weapons, 1 million of us would be killed. Drop those bombs and they will surrender. Well, they were trying to surrender all that summer, but Truman wouldn't listen because Truman wanted to drop the bombs. To show off, to frighten Stalin, to change the balance of power in the world, to declare war on communism. Perhaps we were starting a preemptive world war. Eisenhower hated the dropping of them and thought it should not have been done.
We just thought war was terrible enough as it was. I cannot trace evolution in my dad's thinking. He was complex. He was a 5-star general, but he was never a military fanatic, never. One night in July of 45, that day, the Secretary of War had told my father about the development of the atomic weapon, atomic bomb. We were sitting up in his bedroom, and he said that his own first impression, his own emotion had been to be feeling down low. He wished we hadn't invented it.
In the background was the growing conflict between two great powers to shape the post-war world. Already, an iron curtain had dropped around Poland, Hungary, Yugoslavia.
You see, we had to fight communism wherever it was in the world. So a decision was made that the United States remain militarized permanently.
We lack the weapons to defend ourselves. Build, prepare is the cry. Quickly, the government springs into action and initiates a gigantic rearmament program. A program designed to make America the arsenal of democracy.
From that moment on, the American empire was in every corner of the
in Burma and Iceland.
We were going to maintain dominance, not just of Europe and not just of Japan, but of the entire globe.
Oh, gee, I wish that I could be with you tonight. Gee, I wish. Oh. And gee, I know that everything will be alright. Be alright. The crickets are singing a love song.
What are we fighting for?
Fighting for continued freedom. That's the only way we're going to have it, I think.
Why do we fight? I think that I honestly don't have an answer for it.
It's the people who start the war who know what they're fighting about.
I think we fight for ideals and what we believe in, so I hope that's what it is.
Today, we don't have a broad-based American feeling about why we're fighting in Iraq. People's confidence in the United States is not what it was 15 years ago. It's not what it was during World War II.
Yesterday, USA. Precious celluloids, such as the Why We Fight orientation films, familiarizing our soldiers.
You know, it's interesting, Why We Fight was actually the title of a series of World War II films that were done by one of the great directors.
Master of the art of motion picture entertainment, Frank Capra.
The Frank Capra films, even back then, were propaganda to kind of build up a war fever.
Americans fighting.
But given that it was during a global world war, there were a lot of reasons that Americans embraced.
We're fighting for liberty, the most expensive luxury known to man.
Today, if you went downtown to my local town and you asked 5 people why we're fighting in Iraq, you'd get 5 different answers.
Why do we fight? I'm not quite sure, but I think it's for power and control, for greed.
I'm not sure if we're fighting for the oil or not. We could be, we could not be. The government has more knowledge than I know.
I think everybody has a different idea why we're there, and a lot of people think we shouldn't be.
What we're seeing is a disconnection of our American foreign policy from the citizen, from the average American citizen.
Why do we fight?
Oh, I wish we didn't. I wish we didn't. Sometimes you have to, though.
This is one of my favorite pictures of all time, smiling with his 2 teeth. Man, Jason. What can I do for my son's memory? I'm not a millionaire. I can't build schools and libraries. I'm just a regular cop living on a pension. I want to be able to do something so that hopefully one day I can go over to my son's grave. And I can go over to my son's grave and tell him that I've done something in his memory that hopefully will be a step in preventing another attack like that.
The bomb is designed to be delivered inside a target. So
my expertise is in explosive technology, and so are a lot of my colleagues here at Indian Head. When the Pentagon called, my position then was the head of what we call the payload team. A bomb, it's the nomenclature for bomb. I find it sometimes amusing when people ask me, what do you work in? And I would say explosive, and they would. But our mission was to quickly weaponize what was called a penetrator. It basically was a big bomb engineered to enhance its blast effect inside confined structures such as tunnels, caves, etc.
We're going to attack somebody. We're going to bomb someplace. There's no question about that. The question is, where are we going to do it and why?
Do you think that after an adversary gets nuclear weapons is a better time to engage that adversary than now without?
Iraq continues to flaunt its hostility toward America and to support terror. This is a regime that has something to hide from the civilized world.
The invasion of Iraq in 2003 is to a very considerable extent about repositioning the United States as the country that must be obeyed. It's an easy way to send a signal to the planet that the United States is in charge and it's going to do what it wants, and anybody who defies the United States will be punished.
The decision to attack Iraqi leadership at the opening salvo, it was a bold move. It was a new way of making war, and technology was able to provide our leadership that opportunity.
We had received this new weapon called the Enhanced Guided Bomb Unit 27, and it was like the new candy at the candy store. We needed something that was going to give us the capability to strike through the weather and not worry about having to bring the bombs home.
The whole of the city is still lit very brightly, but nobody's moving on the streets whatsoever. It's like everybody here is holding their breath.
We really didn't know who was there and who was going to take the blow of what we were about to do.
Both Colonel Tuman and I probably had our suspicions about who it was.
We've gotten some indications that it may be Sons, it may be Saddam himself.
Assassination, people sometimes think with precision weapons that maybe you can now assassinate people from very high altitudes. I mean, golly. First of all, if it's a fixed target like a building, you have the time to understand its location. The next hardest target is one that moves around, and the single hardest target of all is a human being.
Sometimes before you can bring about democratic change, you have to remove the obstacle to democratic change. You have to remove Saddam Hussein because there's no hope for democracy with Saddam there.
The point, in many ways, for these guys wasn't just to topple Saddam, it was to transform the Middle East. They want to take the U.S. military and go in and shore up American interest in the key area of the world. And that's their vision. They want to spread democracy around the world on the point of our bayonets.
متمنين للعراق أن يصبح مثل أمريكا.
والله شو أقول لك يجوز أكو ناس ترتاح أكو ناس ما ترتاح. ما أريد مثلا يعني أريد مثل أمريكا مثل شوارعها حدائقها بنائها هيك أريد.
إحنا من البداية واقفين ضد أمريكا، لكن أكو ناس اللي كانوا يرحبون بأمريكا هو قال صدق ديمقراطية وصدق أمريكا تحررنا.
في الصراحة كيفنا كله احنا صفقنا. شو نصيح؟ عاش بوش، مات صدام. احنا جاي نصفق عاش بوش، مات صدام.
I think most Americans don't want to police the world, but I think most Americans understand that if we don't at least help police the world, then no one's going to.
Where the debate and controversy begins is how far does the United States go, and when does it go from a force for good to a force of imperialism?
People complain a lot about American arrogance and American power, but the great threat for the future is not American power and American strength. It would be American weakness and American withdrawal.
They do believe that this is not only for the long-term benefit of the United States, but it's for the long-term benefit of everybody else as well. We'll bring them American values, prosperity, peace, all the rest of it. But the way we're going to do that is to take over, even more than we did at the height of the Cold War.
3, 2, 1, fire!
After the Second World War, the United States literally divided the world up into commands. And some American officer was responsible for every region of the world. There was this domino theory. If any of these places fall to communism, then the next place and the next place and the next place will fall as well, and the next thing you know, they're in Missouri.
Once upon a time, your hometown was safe, but not now. It is possible for a rocket to strike your home, right now, today, right now. And what defense remains? Strength. Strength, ready if we need it.
When my dad first became president, he came in at the real beginning of the thermonuclear age.
I think we have to put the 1950s into perspective. We look back today and we think the 1950s was a period of Elvis Presley and poodle skirts. But in fact, it was a very dangerous period of time.
Defense budgets throughout the Western world doubled or tripled in the 4 years between 48 and 52.
The Soviets are outproducing America's aircraft factories.
There is a threat, but we can't measure how much is enough defense spending to stop the Soviet Union. So by the time Eisenhower is president, there is a huge new flow of cash into defense industries.
He was the first to acknowledge that a permanent military establishment would be required during this period, but that unless we could find some kind of breakthrough, that in fact it would end up creating a terrible cost.
The cost of one modern heavy bomber is this: a modern brick school in more than 30 cities.
It is 2 electric power plants, each serving a town of 60,000 population. It is 2 fine, fully equipped hospitals.
This is not a way of life at all, in any true sense. Under the cloud of threatening war, it is humanity hanging from a cross of iron.
My father, as president, had strong guiding principles. He used to say, modern weapons take food from the hungry and shelter from the homeless. And so he was fighting with the Pentagon all the time. for asking for too much and Congress for giving it to him.
I don't think we should pay 1 cent for defense more than we have to.
Well, Eisenhower saw us starting to build program after program that was just out of control. And his own ability to shape national security policy was being hemmed in by these forces he couldn't control, and he was the president.
On at least one occasion, Eisenhower was heard to say by those in the room, "God help this country when somebody sits at this desk who doesn't know as much about the military as I do."
My fellow Americans, this evening I come to you with a message of leave-taking and farewell, and to share a few final thoughts with you, my countrymen. We have been compelled to create a permanent armaments industry of vast proportions. 3.5 million men and women are directly engaged in the defense establishment. The total influence, economic, political, even spiritual, is felt in every city, every state house, every office of the federal government. We recognize the imperative need for this development, yet we must not fail to comprehend its grave implications. In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist.
You have to realize this is one of the great presidents, great military leaders. On his way out the door, at the end of his second term, he says, by the way, watch out for the military-industrial complex.
People know that he invented the phrase military-industrial complex, but very rarely do you see the whole thing and realize how utterly strident his warning was. I think it's one of the most profound statements ever made by an American president.
Just like George Washington gave his warnings about foreign entanglements and things like that, my dad was giving his warning against letting this military-industrial complex get out of hand.
We must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic processes.
The President has asked Congress for $401.7 billion for fiscal year 2005.
Our country spends more on defense than all of the other 18 members of NATO, plus China, Russia.
From my standpoint, I think numbers almost are distracting.
This is the medium machine gun, 7.62 millimeter, over 450 rounds a minute.
So I'm here to see the hit-to-kill technology. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but it's a missile that goes up and shoots tactical ballistic missiles out of the sky. These are my two daughters.
President Eisenhower's concern about the military-industrial complex, his words have unfortunately come true. He was worried that priorities are set by what benefits corporations as opposed to what benefits the country.
Name any playing card that will come into your mind. 1, 2, 3, name a card. Perfect. Now, we've never met before. No collusion.
Which is really odd because collusion is our business. Yes, collusion with the military.
You know, people sometimes think of the defense budget as you got to arm the troops, defend the nation. But for most people that are involved in it, you realize this is business, competition for contracts between very large corporations.
Industry has to have a bottom line that's black, otherwise their shareholders don't like that. So they have to find ways to interest the government in continuing to buy the product.
Lockheed Martin and McDonnell Douglas and Boeing. Throughout America, there are factories, there are corporations that are involved on a daily basis to produce the weaponry, the ammunition, to carry out the American way of war.
I'm just going to take your driver's license. Hi, sorry, cold hands, warm heart.
The overall Raytheon mission in general is to be the premier supplier of solutions and meet all our customers' needs. Our job is to provide tactical missiles for all practical purposes. Paveway laser-guided bombs, Tomahawk missiles, Stinger missiles, Phalanx, which is actually a great big gun.
The American way of war has been described as overwhelming firepower supported by overwhelming logistics. For every shooter out there, every man with a gun, there are hundreds behind supporting, providing the ammunition, the boots, the gas for the tanks, the oil.
I don't guess I'm real proud of the fact that I make bombs, you know, for what they're used for. I think about when I see something explode over there, did my hands actually help make that, you know? I'd rather really be helping Santa make toys is what I'd really rather be doing.
We try and connect our people with the actual guy in the field, in the plane. Some of them are their sons or their daughters.
Your son is a reservist?
Yes, he is a reservist with the 652nd Engineers. Sometimes I'm okay, and other times I can cry a river.
You wrap the flag around every weapon system. Every weapon system is supposed to be for the troops, give the soldier the tools they need. But really what it ends up becoming is product competition.
If you had the same car year after year, if industry didn't change the car at all, would you buy a different car? No, but when they come out with something that's got extra bells and whistles on it that suits what you need it to do, then you'll buy more.
If you look at the weapons that we're buying, new aircraft carriers, new submarines, F-22 fighters, you know, for an attack that the FBI estimates probably cost Al-Qaeda or Osama $500K to pull off, we are now spending more than we did at the peak of Vietnam. A lot of what's going on is simply because people don't understand the larger architecture of how the Pentagon operates.
Mr. Chairman and distinguished members of the committee, I am the U.S. Air Force Program Manager for the Boeing Company.
Let's use the example of buying a weapon like a new fighter plane for the Air Force. The action usually starts in the Pentagon, maybe at the contractor's initiatives, but essentially everybody's working together.
The KC-767A can carry up to 190 troops.
Basically what you do is you come in and you lowball the initial estimate.
The actual then-year cost is about half that estimate.
You overpromise what it's going to do, and you underestimate the kind of burdens it's going to impose.
We separately met with the companies, and both proposals were very good.
Once the Air Force buys off on it, then you start flooding money to as many congressional districts as possible, as quickly as possible.
The B-2 bomber has a piece of it made in every single state to make sure that if you ever tried to phase that project out, you will get howls from among the most liberal members of Congress.
I believe in this military. I am urging the Senate to support this bill. $66 billion for our men and women in uniform.
Well, I just want to thank the chairman for working with me and adding $100 million to upgrade 10 additional B-1 bombers.
And that B-1 has been a great asset for the projection of power for the
F-35 Joint Strike Fighter, the F-A-22 Raptor, and...
Because the military-industrial complex is not 2 links, it's 3. It's the military and the industry and Congress. For a congressman, defense spending means jobs.
Humvees are manufactured in my district in Mishawaka, Indiana by...
Losing 100 defense jobs in his district could mean 500 votes. It's not just the 100 workers, it's their spouses, it's their children. It's the representative's duty to bring home the bacon.
I am also grateful for the work that the House Armed Services Committee has done to fully fund the FA-22 program this year.
God bless our contractors.
It is our conclusion that the Lockheed Martin team is the winner of the Joint Strike Fighter program.
We have a snapshot in time after September 11th where at least 71 companies that we were able to identify are starting to get contracts to go in Afghanistan and Iraq. All of the top 10 companies had former U.S. officials who had worked in the Pentagon or other parts of the U.S. government on their boards of directors or as their top executives. It's known as the revolving door, and people cash in all the time. Public officials go to work for companies, and they make triple, quadruple, 10 times, sometimes as much money as they used to make in public service.
There's too close a relationship, and there's outright, I hate to use the word corruption, but it borders on it, the behavior of some of these individuals, both in industry and in the Pentagon.
The number one recipient of contracts was Vice President Cheney's former company, Halliburton, and its subsidiary, Kellogg Brown & Root.
KBR. We're the Army's contractor on the battlefield. Currently 65,000 KBR people around the world assisting the troops. And 10 of what?
You know, the military-industrial complex isn't just the people in the Pentagon and the people producing the weapons. It's now increasingly got a very large service sector.
Ham and eggs.
Things that troops used to do, like peel potatoes and do laundry, we now have contractors doing.
Somebody has to do this work. And the Halliburton thing is just an outrageous effort to associate the vice president with the activities of a company with which he has no connection at all.
Congressional critics are questioning whether Dick Cheney helped Halliburton get billions.
The FBI has revealed it is expanding its investigation into how Halliburton Company billed taxpayers for its contract work in Iraq.
And it now appears some of those contracts were awarded with the knowledge and approval of the Vice President's office, which would seem to contradict his previous statements.
I have absolutely no influence of, involvement of, knowledge of, in any way, shape, or form of contracts.
We did a report that took 2.5 years, $600,000, 33 people, including 10 investigative reporters on 6 continents, looking at private military companies and outsourcing war all over the world. And we noticed that in 1992, there was a contract of $9 million given out to a company, Kellogg Brown & Root, to study the idea, should the Pentagon start using the private sector to do some of the support type functions like food service, latrine duty, but even maybe some military things as well. And the Secretary of Defense at the time was one Dick Cheney. So Cheney gives the contract out. Kellogg Brown & Root comes back and says, this is a terrific idea. The next 10 years, they get 700 or 800 contracts to do just that.
Well, I ran Halliburton. I'm proud of it. Halliburton's a quintessential.
This company brought in a Rolodex guy, a former U.S. congressman, defense secretary, chief of staff to a president, to make sure that he could get doors opened not only in Washington, but in capitals all over the world. And yes, he becomes personally wealthy from that. No question about it. His net worth went from $1 million or less to $60 or $70 million in the span of 5 years.
Are you ready to take the oath?
I am.
Please raise your right hand and repeat after me.
So we elected a government contractor as vice president.
Congratulations, Mr. Vice President.
This could be Indonesia, sounds like Russia, Nigeria. No, it's the United States of America, and everything I just said is entirely legal, and it is our system of legal corruption.
If I am sure of anything, I'm sure of this. Vice President Cheney had nothing to do with the award of any contract to Halliburton. He wouldn't pick up the phone. He wouldn't whisper in someone's ear, I know him. He just wouldn't do it.
It looks bad. It looks bad. And apparently Halliburton more than once has overcharged the federal government. That's wrong.
How would you tackle a problem like that?
I would have a public investigation of what they've done.
So,
What's that? Vice President's on the phone? Okay.
probably have to take the call.
Whenever you get into a situation where anybody's got unwarranted influence, it has the potential to be deeply distorting. It corrupts our system.
You don't have to show that he directly came in and hit the cash register button, the door flew open, and he took some money out and put it in his pocket. It's to say anybody allocating things at the Department of Defense knows who the vice president is, knows what his connections are in Halliburton.
We have a process that has a seamlessness where the corporate interests that stand to benefit are so intertwined and interwoven with the political forces that the financial elites and the political elites have become the same people.
You do have to follow the money. If you follow the money here, it's not so much that Halliburton wanted a war, so they told Dick Cheney to go get one for him. It wasn't that. But you do get a willingness to go to war.